The wedding dress hung in the window like a death shroud, and Colton Miles couldn't understand why everyone kept congratulating him. 3 days ago, he had been free. 3 days ago, Delilah Rhodes was just a name whispered in corners, a ghost story told to frighten children. Now she was his future wife, and the entire town was acting like he'd just been handed a loaded pistol with the hammer pulled back. No one would meet his eyes. Colton stood outside the general store, the morning sun feeling cold on his skin. He watched people literally cross the dusty street to avoid walking on the same side as him. Mrs. Henderson, a woman who'd patched his scraped knees since he was a boy, saw him and yanked her two small children closer, her face a mask of something that looked a lot like fear. Old Tom, who usually sat on his porch with a friendly wave for everyone, took one look at Colton and vanished back inside his house, the screen door slamming shut with a sound of finality. Even the town's mangy dog, a creature that would befriend a rattlesnake for a scrap of food, whimpered and backed away when he got close. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. Wade McKinley had made the announcement 3 days ago. He'd stood in the center of town, his voice booming over the quiet bustle, a man who acted like he owned every soul in it. Colton was starting to realize that maybe he actually did. The debt his father had left behind wasn't just big, it was a canyon, deep and dark enough to swallow a family for generations. And now McKinley owned that debt, which meant he also owned Colton. "You'll marry the widow Rhodes," McKinley had said, his words not a suggestion, but a verdict. "Saturday morning, consider it payment in full for your father's obligations." Colton had tried to speak, tried to argue that a man couldn't be sold like livestock. But McKinley's men, two hulking figures who looked like they were carved from granite, had moved in closer. Their hands rested on the pistols at their hips. The message was crystal clear. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a sentencing. He looked around, desperate, searching for a single friendly face, for someone to say this was wrong, that it couldn't be legal. He found nothing, just averted eyes and the nervous shuffling of feet on wooden boardwalks. And that's when he noticed the first truly strange thing. The town wasn't just afraid of Wade McKinley. Everyone was always a little scared of McKinley. No, this was different. This was a deeper, colder fear. They were afraid of what McKinley was forcing him to do. "Why her?" Colton had managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper. McKinley's smile was as cold and sharp as a winter wind cutting through a threadbare coat. "Because, boy," he'd said, leaning in so only Colton could hear, "some debts require more than just money to settle. And Delilah Rhodes, she has her own debts to pay." The way McKinley said her name, the mix of venom and something that sounded almost like triumph, made Colton's skin crawl. There was history there. Something dark and unfinished, like a story with the last page ripped out. But when Colton had tried to press for more details, McKinley had just laughed, a harsh, grating sound, before turning and walking away. He left Colton standing alone in the town square, drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. Now with the wedding just hours away, Colton tried to piece together the terrifying puzzle of his intended bride. Delilah Rhodes, the widow. Everyone knew she'd been married before, to a man named Thomas who had died under circumstances no one ever discussed openly. They just called it an accident, but the way they said the word made it sound like a lie. She lived alone in the house at the end of Maple Street, the one with the black shutters that were always, always closed. People said she never smiled. They said she never spoke unless spoken to. And they said she never, ever looked anyone directly in the eye. But there was something else, something more. Something that made even the toughest, meanest men in town go quiet and uncomfortable whenever her name came up. He'd seen it in their faces when McKinley made the announcement. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that looked disturbingly like guilt, as if they were all complicit in a crime they were too scared to name. The church bell began to ring, a hollow, mournful sound calling him to his fate. As Colton started the long walk toward the small chapel on the hill, he noticed something else that was odd. For a woman everyone in town was so terrified of, Delilah Rhodes sure had a lot of people who refused to attend her wedding. The streets were emptying. Doors were closing. It was like the whole town was going into hiding. The chapel was nearly empty when he arrived, a vast silent space that seemed to amplify his own pounding heart. The emptiness was a confirmation of his darkest fears. Something was fundamentally wrong with this entire arrangement. Only one man sat in the pews. Wade McKinley, of course, positioned in the front row, like a king watching a play he'd written himself. He was flanked by his two stone-faced men. The preacher, Reverend Hayes, stood at the altar, looking more like a man about to face a firing squad than a man about to perform a holy sacrament. He kept nervously checking his pocket watch and wiping beads of sweat from his forehead, even though the morning air was crisp and cool. Colton had expected to wait for his bride, but Delilah Rhodes was already there. She stood at the altar with her back to the door, a solitary figure in the cavernous room. She wasn't wearing white. She wore a simple, severe black dress, the kind of thing a woman would wear to a funeral. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. When she finally turned to face him, Colton felt the air rush out of his lungs. She was nothing like he had expected. The monster from the town's whispers, the fearsome widow, was actually beautiful. Not in a soft, gentle way, but in a stark, striking way, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and sharp green eyes that seemed to see right through him. But it was the expression in those eyes that made his chest tighten with a sudden, sharp unease. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hatred, it wasn't any of the things he'd braced himself for. It was pure, bottomless resignation, as if she wasn't just attending her own execution. She was the one laying her head on the chopping block. "You're younger than I thought," she said, her voice quiet and steady, but with a slight tremor underneath that seemed to surprise even her. "And you're not what they said you were," Colton replied, his voice rough. He couldn't stop studying her face, searching for any hint of the monster the town had painted her to be. For the first time, something flickered in her green eyes. It might have been a ghost of amusement, or it might have been a fresh wave of pain. "They never tell the truth about me," she said, her gaze drifting past him to where McKinley sat watching them. "But they're about to get what they've wanted for a long, long time." Before Colton could ask what she meant, what they all wanted, Reverend Hayes cleared his throat with a loud, nervous cough and launched into the ceremony. The words felt hollow and profane in the empty chapel, echoing off the stone walls like accusations. When it came time for the vows, Delilah spoke them with a chilling, mechanical precision, as if she'd rehearsed this moment of surrender 1,000 times in her mind. Colton found himself watching her, trying to solve the impossible riddle she presented. If she was so dangerous, why did she seem so utterly defeated? And why was Wade McKinley smiling like he'd just won the most important poker game of his life? "Do you, Colton Miles, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Hayes asked, and his voice was definitely shaking now. Colton hesitated. Every single instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around and run. To run not from Delilah, but from the invisible trap that was closing around both of them. But the debt was real. His father's name was real. And McKinley's men were very, very real. And sometimes a man has no choice but to walk straight into the darkness and just pray he can find his way back out. "I do," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The moment the words left his lips, the atmosphere in the chapel shifted. It was a physical change, like a drop in air pressure before a storm. McKinley's already wide smile stretched even further, a predatory slash in his face. Delilah's shoulders sagged, as if she'd been holding up an enormous, invisible weight that had just come crashing down. And Reverend Hayes rushed through the rest of the ceremony so fast the words blurred together, like he couldn't wait to be done with it, to wash his hands of whatever sin he'd just committed. "You may, you may kiss the bride," the Reverend stammered, but he was already backing away from the altar, his eyes wide with something that looked like terror. As Colton leaned in toward his new wife, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear, Delilah whispered something. It was so quiet, so faint, that only he could possibly hear it. "I'm sorry," she breathed, her lips barely moving. "I'm so sorry for what they're going to do to you." Before he could process her words, before he could ask what she meant, the huge chapel doors burst open with a deafening crash. Three riders thundered up to the entrance, their horses rearing and snorting. The men's faces were grim, their eyes hard as stone, and they were all looking straight at Delilah. The three riders who burst through the chapel doors were not strangers to Delilah Rhodes. Colton could tell by the way her entire body went rigid, her breath catching in her throat. She became perfectly still, like a deer that has just caught the scent of wolves on the wind. The leader, a weathered man with silver hair and eyes as cold and blue as a frozen lake, dismounted slowly. His spurs clicked against the wooden floor with each deliberate, menacing step, the sound echoing in the sudden, dead silence of the chapel. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It was the kind of voice that carried an authority that didn't come from a badge or a title, but from years and years of taking exactly what he wanted. He swept his cold gaze over the scene, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. "Looks like we missed the ceremony, Delilah." McKinley rose from his pew. For the first time since Colton had met him, the all-powerful Wade McKinley looked genuinely nervous. His usual smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a tense, wary expression. "Marcus," McKinley said, his voice tight, "you weren't invited to this wedding." The man named Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "Wasn't I?" he replied, his piercing blue eyes never leaving Delilah's face. "See, that's funny, Wade, because last I checked, my brother's widow still belonged to the Garrett family, and family business is always our business." Garrett. The name hit Colton like a physical blow. Marcus Garrett. He'd heard that name before, always spoken in the same hushed, fearful tones people used for Delilah. The Garrett brothers. They had controlled the cattle trade across 3 counties, a ruthless empire built on intimidation and force, until something happened. Something that had shattered their power, something involving a dead brother, and a widow who had apparently inherited more than just a lonely house. The pieces began to slam into place in Colton's mind, forming a picture he did not want to see. "Your brother's been dead for 2 years, Marcus," McKinley shot back, his hand moving subtly, almost invisibly toward the inside of his jacket where he kept his gun. "His debts died with him." "Did they?" Marcus took another slow step forward, closer to the altar. Colton noticed that his 2 companions hadn't just stood by the door. They had moved, positioning themselves to block both exits. They were trapping everyone inside. "Because from what I hear," Marcus continued, his eyes finally shifting to Colton, pinning him with a look of pure contempt, "that debt just got transferred to a new husband. Isn't that right, boy?" Colton felt every eye in the room turn to him. He was the center of a storm he didn't understand. But before he could find his voice, it was Delilah who spoke, her own voice surprisingly strong and clear. "Leave him out of this, Marcus. He doesn't know anything. He's not part of the arrangement." "Arrangement?" Colton's head whipped back to his new wife, then to the men who looked ready to turn the house of God into a slaughterhouse. "What arrangement?" he demanded. Marcus Garrett laughed again, that same cold, empty sound. "She didn't tell you? Oh, Delilah, that's not very wifely of you." He took another step, now standing so close Colton could smell the trail dust and whiskey on him. "Your pretty new bride here has been sitting on something. Something that belongs to my family. Something my brother died trying to protect. And now that she's married again, well, from a legal standpoint, that makes things very, very interesting." Delilah's face had gone deathly pale, but her chin was high, her gaze unwavering. "I told you 2 years ago, Marcus. I don't know where it is." "Maybe," Marcus said, and his hand moved, not to his gun, but to the inside of his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It looked official, covered in stamps and seals. "But maybe your new husband will be a little more cooperative than you've been, especially when he learns what happens to people who keep secrets from the Garrett family." The paper he held out wasn't a threat. It was something worse. It was some kind of legal document, a warrant or a claim, and whatever it was, it made McKinley's face go ashen. He looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Colton was finally starting to understand. This wedding was never about his father's debt. That was just a lie, a tool to get him here. This was about something else entirely, something far more dangerous, something that had already gotten at least one man killed and was about to put him, Colton Miles, squarely in the crosshairs. "You have 24 hours, Marcus Garrett said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He carefully folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. Find what belongs to us, or your new marriage is going to be a very, very short one. With that, he turned his back on them. The three Garrett men filed out of the chapel as silently and suddenly as they had appeared, leaving a thick, suffocating tension behind them. As the sound of their horses faded into the distance, Delilah finally turned and looked directly at Colton. And in her eyes, he saw something that chilled him more than any threat, more than any gun. It wasn't fear for herself. It wasn't regret for what she dragged him into. It was pity, pure, heartbreaking pity, for him. What Colton saw in Delilah's eyes wasn't just pity. It was a terrifying certainty. She looked at him the way you look at a dead man who just doesn't know it yet. His new wife, the woman he was now legally bound to, believed he was going to die because of her. And the worst part? She had already accepted it as inevitable. That realization hit him harder than any punch, colder than any threat Marcus Garrett could have made. The chapel emptied out with astonishing speed after the Garretts left. It was as if a spell had been broken. Reverend Hayes mumbled something about urgent parish business and practically sprinted for the side door, his robes flapping behind him. McKinley lingered for a moment, his face a thunderous mask of fury, and was that fear? His earlier confidence was completely gone, shattered. He gave Colton and Delilah one last hard look, a look that promised retribution, before he and his men stormed out. Within minutes, Colton and Delilah stood utterly alone in the small, cold building that had just witnessed the strangest, most terrifying wedding ceremony in the town's history. The silence was deafening. "We need to talk," Delilah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her composure was cracking, her hands trembling slightly. "But not here. Never here. These walls have ears, and Wade McKinley pays very well for information." They walked in a tense, heavy silence to her house at the end of Maple Street, the same house the entire town avoided, like it carried the plague. As they got closer, Colton could see why it unsettled people so deeply. The place didn't just look abandoned. It looked like it was actively trying to repel the world. The black shutters weren't just closed against the sun. They were nailed shut from the inside. The wood splintered around the rusty nail heads. The front porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the paint was peeling off in long, gray strips. Weeds had grown wild and tall, choking the life out of what might have once been a garden, their thorny branches reaching up to hide the lower windows. It was a house that was holding its breath. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelling of dust and old secrets. It was surprisingly clean, meticulously tidy, but it felt less like a home and more like a fortress. Heavy, dark curtains blocked out almost all the natural light, plunging the rooms into a perpetual twilight. And as his eyes adjusted, Colton noticed something else that sent a shiver down his spine. Every single window wasn't just curtained. It was boarded up from the inside with thick, heavy wooden planks. Someone had turned this place into a stronghold, a prison, built to keep the world out, or to keep something in. "Sit down," Delilah said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She gestured to a worn armchair near the cold, black fireplace. "I need to tell you what you've gotten yourself into." For the next hour, Delilah spoke. She laid out the story in careful, measured sentences, as if each word was a heavy stone she had to lift. Her voice never wavered, but her eyes were haunted. Her first husband, Thomas Rhodes, hadn't just been a rancher. He'd been McKinley's business partner, a silent partner in a scheme that had gone very wrong, very fast. When Thomas died in what everyone in town called a tragic accident, he'd left behind more than just a grieving widow. He'd left behind evidence, proof of something so damning it could destroy McKinley's reputation, his empire, and possibly end his life. "The night before he died," Delilah explained, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, "Thomas told me he hid a metal box somewhere in this house. He said it was our only protection." "Protection from what?" Colton pressed. "Inside that box," she continued, her eyes dark, "are documents. Ledgers, bills of sale, signed affidavits. They prove that Wade McKinley has been systematically stealing cattle from every single rancher in 3 counties. He's been rebranding them and selling them across the territorial border for years. Thomas. Thomas was going to expose him. Colton leaned forward, his mind racing to connect the dots. And McKinley thinks you know where the box is? A bitter, weary sigh escaped her lips. I've torn this house apart. Every floorboard, every wall, every corner. I've searched for 2 years. If it's here, Thomas hid it so well that no one will ever find it. But McKinley doesn't believe me. He thinks I'm lying, holding it over his head. That's why he did this. Why he forced you to marry me. He thinks a new husband could either help him find it or give him a legal claim to everything Thomas owned, including the house and whatever's inside it. Colton finished for her, the cold logic of McKinley's plan settling in his gut like a stone. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the suffocating quiet of the house, the rhythmic clatter of approaching horses. It wasn't just one or two, it was a group. Delilah shot to her feet, her body instantly tense again. She moved to the front window, peering through a tiny, carefully made gap in the curtains. Her face, already pale, went as white as fresh snow. "They're back," she whispered, her voice a thread of pure dread. "It's the Garretts." Then she moved to a side window, looking toward the backyard. Her breath hitched. "And this time," she said, her voice shaking, "they brought shovels." The sound began almost immediately, the sharp, rhythmic chunk of metal striking earth. Thump, thump, thump. It came from the backyard, a steady, determined beat that spoke of purpose. Marcus Garrett and his men weren't wasting any more time with threats or negotiations. They weren't asking questions. They were digging. And from the confident, methodical way they worked, it was sickeningly clear they knew exactly where to look. Colton moved to join Delilah at the window, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. What he saw made his blood run cold. The three Garrett men were in the overgrown backyard, their coats off, their sleeves rolled up. They had already opened a deep, ugly hole in the ground near a gnarled old oak tree. Dirt was flying as they worked with the grim efficiency of experienced gravediggers. But it wasn't the digging itself that sent a spike of fear through him. It was the fourth man, the one who had just joined them. He sat motionless on horseback, a dark silhouette against the afternoon sun, watching the house, watching them. His posture was one of absolute patience, the coiled stillness of a hunter waiting for his prey to bolt from its hiding place. And the fourth man was Wade McKinley. "This is wrong," Delilah whispered, her breath fogging the dusty glass. "They're working together, McKinley and the Garretts. They hate each other. This shouldn't be happening." Colton studied the scene more carefully, forcing himself to think past the fear. The hole wasn't random. It was positioned with precision, exactly between two specific, rotting fence posts, as if the location had been marked or measured long beforehand. This wasn't a guess. Either the Garretts and McKinley had been planning this excavation for months, or someone had given them very, very detailed information about where to dig. Someone who knew the secrets of this property. "Who else knew about the box?" Colton asked, his voice low and urgent. "Who else did you tell?" "No one," she insisted, shaking her head. "Only Thomas and me. I never spoke of it to a soul. It was too dangerous." Her voice trailed off. Her eyes widened in dawning horror. A small, choked sound escaped her lips. "Oh, no. No, it can't be." "Who?" Colton demanded, grabbing her arm. "Delilah, who is it?" "Mercy," she breathed, the name a poisoned whisper. "Who's Mercy?" My my friend," Delilah said, stumbling back from the window as if she'd been struck. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now. "She's the only person in town who still talks to me, the only one who wasn't afraid. Last year, when I was at my most desperate, she helped me search the house." Delilah's face crumpled in betrayal and pain. "I told her everything, everything about the box, about what Thomas had hidden inside it, about McKinley. I trusted her." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying, sickening clarity. Mercy Whitmore, her only friend. She hadn't been a friend at all. She'd been a spy, feeding information to Marcus Garrett, and probably to McKinley too, playing both sides against each other. Every whispered conversation, every shared secret, Every desperate moment when Delilah had lowered her guard and trusted someone had been a lie. Mercy had been reporting everything back to her enemies. She hadn't helped Delilah search for the box. She had been searching for it herself. Outside, one of the diggers let out a triumphant shout. "Got it! We hit something!" The others immediately stopped and gathered around the hole, their faces lit with greedy excitement. They had found it. The secret Thomas Rhodes died to protect was about to be unearthed. "We have to go," Colton said, his voice urgent, grabbing Delilah's arm again. "Right now. Out the front, before they pull that thing from the ground." But Delilah pulled away from him. Her expression, which had been a mixture of fear and betrayal, hardened into something else, something fierce and unyielding, a sudden, dangerous resolve. "No," she said, her voice low and steady. "I am tired of running. I am tired of hiding in this house like a coward. If they've found what Thomas hid, then it's time to face whatever comes next. On my own terms." "You don't understand," Colton insisted, his mind racing. "If that box has evidence against McKinley, and the Garretts get their hands on it, they won't use it for justice. They'll use it to blackmail him, to control him. That makes them the most powerful, most dangerous men in 3 counties. A strange, cold light entered Delilah's eyes. "Then we'd better make sure they don't get to use it." Before Colton could react, before he could even think to stop her, she was moving, not toward the door to escape, but toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen. Her hand reached for something hidden in the dark space behind a loose cabinet. When she turned back to face him, the woman who had looked so defeated at the altar was gone. In her place was someone else entirely. She was holding a rifle. It was old, but it looked well-maintained and frequently used. She checked its ammunition with a practiced efficiency that was both terrifying and impressive. "What are you doing?" Colton demanded, his own fear warring with a sudden, grudging respect. "What I should have done 2 years ago," she replied, her voice as cold and hard as the steel of the rifle barrel. "Thomas died protecting those documents. The least I can do is make sure his death meant something." The shouting from the backyard was getting louder, more urgent. There was a sound of straining ropes and groaning wood. Whatever they had found, it had exceeded their wildest expectations, and they were about to bring it into the light. The metal box they heaved from the ground wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't the small, portable strongbox Delilah had described. What the Garrett brothers and McKinley's men dragged from the hole was something massive, something the size of a coffin. It was made of dark, rusted iron, and it was so heavy it took all of them straining together to lift it clear of the ground. Even from the kitchen window, Colton could see that whatever Thomas Rhodes had buried in his backyard, it was far more significant and far more sinister than a simple collection of documents. "That's not it," Delilah said, her voice a confused whisper. She lowered the rifle slightly, her brow furrowed. "That's not the box Thomas told me about. This, this doesn't make any sense." On the lawn, Marcus Garrett and Wade McKinley were examining the metal container with a kind of feverish excitement, all pretense of their feud forgotten in the face of this discovery. They ran their hands along its pitted surface like they were greeting a long-lost friend. Then McKinley found what he was looking for, a series of heavy rusted clasps along one side. His triumphant shout carried clearly through the afternoon air. 20 years, McKinley roared, a wild, greedy look in his eyes. He looked at Marcus, and they shared a look of pure, unholy glee. 20 years we've been looking for this. 20 years. The words hung in the air, changing everything. If they had been looking for this for 2 decades, it meant whatever was buried in Delilah's backyard had been there long, long before Thomas Rhodes ever bought the property. Long before he'd ever met his future wife. Long before McKinley's cattle rustling scheme even began. The realization hit both Colton and Delilah at the exact same moment, and it shattered every assumption they had. The world tilted on its axis. "He wasn't hiding evidence against McKinley," Delilah whispered, her face a mask of shock. "He found something. Thomas found something that was already here, something that belonged to them." The huge metal container creaked open with a loud, grinding screech that made everyone in the yard flinch. Marcus Garrett, his hands trembling with anticipation, reached inside. He didn't pull out ledgers or papers. He pulled out bundles, dozens of them, all wrapped in thick oiled cloth, each one carefully preserved against the decades of damp earth. He tore the cloth off the first bundle, and even from the house Colton could see it, the unmistakable buttery gleam of gold coins catching the afternoon sunlight. Confederate gold, Delilah breathed, the words barely audible. My God, Thomas found a cache of Confederate gold on our property. The implications were staggering, almost too vast to comprehend. Near the end of the war, desperate Confederate forces had buried secret caches of treasure all across the frontier, hoping to one day fund a resistance that never materialized. Most of those caches were lost to history, their locations dying with the men who had buried them. They were the stuff of legend, of campfire stories. But they were real, and Thomas Rhodes had somehow stumbled upon one of the largest lost treasures in the entire territory. And instead of reporting it, instead of turning it in, he had kept the secret to himself. He had reburied it, planning what? To use it? To keep it safe? Whatever his plan was, it had gotten him killed. And now his secret was out. In the yard, Marcus Garrett and Wade McKinley were laughing, clapping each other on the back like old friends. Their feud, their hatred, all of it was forgotten, washed away by a river of gold. They began loading the heavy bundles into saddlebags with methodical, greedy efficiency. But their celebration was about to be cut short. A new sound drifted from the front of the house. The thunder of approaching riders. Not just one or two, a lot of them. Moving fast. The arrival of new players in this deadly game. Through the front window, Colton could see them now. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't the law. It was another group, at least a dozen armed men, surrounding the property, cutting off any chance of escape. Garrett! A new voice boomed across the yard, sharp and commanding. McKinley, step away from that treasure. It's on my land now. And according to the new deed filed this morning, that makes it mine. Colton and Delilah stared at each other in disbelief. The man speaking was Reverend Hayes, and behind him, her face a smug mask of victory, sat Mercy Whitmore. The standoff that followed was like watching two vicious storms collide over a single, unlucky field. Marcus Garrett and Wade McKinley, who had been allies just moments before, were now enemies again, united only in their shock and fury at this new betrayal. They and their men scrambled for cover behind the old oak tree, their hands flying to their weapons. On the other side, Reverend Hayes and his newly assembled posse of gunmen spread out across the front yard. They weren't parishioners. They were hard-faced men with rifles, mercenaries by the look of them. They formed a deadly circle around the property, making escape impossible for anyone caught in the middle. "Your land, Hayes!" McKinley bellowed, his face purple with rage. "You sanctimonious fraud! I'll see you burn for this!" "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Wade," the preacher called back, his voice dripping with false piety. He held up a legal document, the deed to Delilah's property. "And he has delivered this bounty unto me. Mercy here was kind enough to inform me of this opportunity, in exchange for a small share, of course." Mercy Whitmore, Delilah's friend, just smiled, a cold, predatory curving of her lips. She had played them all. She had told Garrett and McKinley where to dig, setting them against each other, knowing they would do the dirty work for her. And all the while she had been working with a third party, the preacher, to legally steal the land out from under all of them. It was a brilliant, ruthless, four-way cross. "This gold was buried by my grandfather," Marcus Garrett roared from behind the tree. "It's Garrett family blood treasure. You have no claim." Delilah grabbed Colton's arm, her grip as tight as a vice. Her knuckles were white. "We're trapped," she hissed. "We're trapped between all of them. When the shooting starts, none of them are going to worry about witnesses." As if to prove her point, the first gunshot rang out, a deafening crack that shattered the tense silence. It was impossible to tell who fired first. It didn't matter. The war for the Confederate gold had officially begun, and Delilah Rhodes's house was the battlefield. The gunfight that erupted in Delilah's yard was a maelstrom of chaos and violence, unlike anything Colton had ever witnessed. It wasn't a duel. It was a desperate, multi-sided brawl for a fortune. McKinley's men and the Garretts were pinned down behind the oak tree, caught between the open yard and the preacher's surrounding force. Bullets splintered the fence posts into kindling, shattered the remaining windows of the house, and tore ugly gouges in the ancient oak. All three factions fought with a savage desperation, their greed overriding any sense of caution. "The cellar!" Delilah shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire. She grabbed Colton's hand, pulling him away from the windows, just as a spray of bullets punched through the kitchen walls above them. She dragged him toward a section of the floor that looked no different from the rest, but she knew exactly where to pull. A hidden trap door swung open, revealing a set of steep, stone steps leading down into darkness. "Thomas built it for storage," she yelled, her voice echoing in the small space. "But it connects to the old mine shaft behind the house." They dropped into the cramped, musty space, pulling the heavy doors shut just as the battle outside escalated into a full-blown war. The cellar was small and dark, smelling of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, like old blood. But Delilah was right about the tunnel. At the far end of the cellar, behind a stack of rotting crates, was a narrow passage. It wasn't man-made. It looked like a natural fissure in the rock that had been widened, leading away from the house and deeper underground. It was a passage carved by miners who had worked this land decades before anyone dreamed of cattle ranches or buried treasure. "Where does it come out?" Colton asked, his voice rough as he followed her into the suffocating narrow space. "About 50 yards behind the oak tree," she replied, her voice tight with tension. "In a thicket of brush. It should be hidden." The tunnel was longer and more claustrophobic than it looked. The air grew thin and cold, and the sound of the gunfight above them became a muffled, rhythmic booming, like a distant, angry heartbeat. By the time they finally saw a faint glimmer of light ahead and emerged from the hidden exit, the battle had reached a fever pitch. Peering through the screen of thorny brush that concealed the tunnel's mouth, Colton could see the chaos clearly. Marcus Garrett and his two men, along with the few remaining McKinley loyalists, were pinned down, using the oak tree and the freshly dug hole for cover. They were putting up a hell of a fight, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. The preacher's men were closing in, moving from cover to cover with professional discipline. But as Colton watched, he noticed something strange, something that didn't make sense. None of them were paying any attention to the gold. The huge iron container sat open beside the oak tree, its precious contents spilling out onto the blood-soaked ground. Bundles of gold coins lay scattered in the dirt. But Hayes, Garrett, and McKinley's men seemed more interested in killing each other than in claiming the very prize they were supposedly fighting and dying for. "This isn't about the treasure anymore," Colton realized aloud, the thought sending a fresh chill through him. "This is personal." Delilah nodded grimly, her eyes fixed on the battle. "It always was. Thomas told me once that Marcus blamed McKinley for his other brother's death, years ago. Said McKinley promised him protection during a cattle deal that went bad, then left him to face a gang of rustlers all alone. He bled out in the dust for hours. The final bloody pieces of a 20-year vendetta were finally falling into place. The Confederate gold hadn't started this war. It had just provided the spark to light a fuse that had been burning for decades. McKinley had used Colton's forced marriage to get to the property. Marcus had used Mercy to find out when. And Mercy and the preacher had used them all to get the deed. It was a tangled knot of greed and revenge, and they were all pulling on the rope, trying to hang each other. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the cacophony of the gunfight. It was a sound Colton recognized, but it was the last thing he ever expected to hear. It was a high-pitched, piercing whistle, the kind used to signal a cavalry charge. And from over the ridge behind the preacher's men, a new line of riders appeared. "The sheriff?" Delilah said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. Someone in town must have finally called the law. But when the riders crested the hill and charged down into the fray, Colton saw that his new wife was tragically wrong. The men approaching weren't wearing sheriff's badges. They were wearing dusty, ragged blue uniforms, the uniforms of Union soldiers. And their leader, a man with a long, gray beard and a crazed look in his eye, was screaming a name over and over again. "It's the treasure of the 3rd Infantry," he shrieked, his voice cracking with madness. "Our gold, stolen from us, and we've come back to reclaim it." They weren't bounty hunters. They weren't lawmen. They were something else entirely, something impossible. The descendants of the very soldiers who had been robbed of the gold decades ago, a lost patrol whose story had become a ghost story, and they had been hunting for it ever since. A fifth faction had just entered the war. Marcus Garrett's desperate decision, upon seeing the charging line of what looked like ghosts in Union uniforms, was to forget the feud, forget revenge, and grab as much gold as he could carry. He made a panicked run for the horses, his arms laden with bundles of coins. But the newcomers, this phantom patrol, were ready. The moment Marcus broke from cover, a volley of coordinated rifle fire erupted from the charging line. The bullets cut him down before he'd taken 5 steps. His men, seeing their leader fall in a hail of lead, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in a gesture of surrender that would not be honored. The Union ghost rode them down without slowing. McKinley, seeing the tide turn so impossibly, tried to take advantage of the chaos. He ordered his few remaining men to rush the oak tree and claim the rest of the treasure. It was a fatal, greedy mistake. The Phantom Patrol had no intention of sharing their prize with anyone. They wheeled their horses and met McKinley's charge with a second devastating volley that left him and his men dead or dying in the dirt. From their hidden position at the tunnel entrance, Colton and Delilah could only watch in stunned, silent horror. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a systematic execution. The Union Patrol moved with a terrifying, single-minded purpose. They weren't interested in prisoners. They weren't interested in negotiations. They were methodically, brutally eliminating every single person who knew about the Confederate gold, ensuring they would be the only ones left to claim it. Next, they turned their attention to the preacher and his hired guns. Reverend Hayes, his face a mask of disbelief and terror, tried to rally his men, but they were no match for the disciplined, fanatical charge. The battle was over in less than a minute. Mercy Whitmore tried to flee on her horse, but one of the soldiers rode her down, his saber flashing in the afternoon sun. The yard fell silent. The only sounds were the groans of the dying and the victorious shouts of the Phantom Patrol as they began gathering their long-lost gold. "They'll search the house next," Delilah whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. "When they don't find us among the dead, they'll know there are witnesses. They'll hunt us down." Colton's mind was racing, desperately trying to find a way out of a situation that was not just hopeless, but insane. They were trapped, with a small army of what seemed to be vengeful ghosts standing between them and freedom. Then he remembered something Delilah had said earlier, something about the tunnels, the mine. If Thomas Rhodes had connected the cellar to an old mine shaft, there might be other passages, other ways to move unseen beneath the property. "The mine," he said suddenly, grabbing her hand. "How extensive is it? Where does it go?" "Thomas said it was a whole system," Delilah replied, her eyes wide with confusion. "He said it connected to 3 different properties before it was abandoned." Why? A desperate, terrible idea was forming in Colton's mind. An idea born of pure, last-ditch survival. He looked from the bodies littering the yard to the triumphant soldiers gathering their gold, and then back to the dark mouth of the tunnel. "Because those men are about to learn," Colton said, his voice a low, grim whisper, "that some treasures aren't worth the price you pay to get them back." Working with a frantic, desperate speed, Colton and Delilah scrambled back through the tunnel to the cellar. From there they found it, the main mineshaft entrance Thomas had discovered, a dark, gaping maw in the foundation of the house. A narrow, rickety-looking passage led deeper underground. But instead of following it to what might have been an escape, Colton began grabbing everything flammable he could find in the cellar. Old newspapers, splintered wooden crates, furniture, even bottles of lamp oil Delilah had stored. "What are you doing?" Delilah asked, her voice tight with panic as he began piling the material at the base of the mine's main support beams. "Creating a problem that's bigger than Confederate gold," Colton replied, his hands working feverishly. He uncorked a bottle of oil and began soaking the dry, ancient wood of the support beams. "You said this mine runs under the entire property, under the whole yard. If it collapses—" Understanding, followed by horror, dawned in Delilah's eyes. "It takes everything above it down, too." "Everything and everyone," Colton confirmed, his face grim, including their precious treasure. It was a monstrous gamble. They had no way of knowing how stable the mine system was or how far the collapse would spread. They could end up burying themselves along with everyone else, but it was the only chance they had. They had just enough time to light the fire and retreat deep into a side tunnel before the flames took hold. The fire spread faster than either of them could have imagined, racing along the oil-soaked wood like a living thing. It ignited pockets of methane gas that had been accumulating in the dark for decades. The explosion that followed wasn't just a single blast, it was a chain reaction, a rolling underground earthquake that shook the very foundations of the earth for miles around. The ground in the backyard heaved upward, then simply vanished. When the dust and smoke finally began to clear, the old oak tree, the iron box, the scattered gold, and the entire Phantom Patrol had disappeared. In their place was a massive, gaping crater, 50 feet wide and just as deep. The earth had swallowed them all whole. The few surviving horses, their reins trailing, galloped away in a blind panic, spooked beyond recovery by the massive, world-ending cave-in. 3 days later, Colton and Delilah stood at the edge of town with 2 horses and enough supplies for a long journey west. The official story, cooked up by a town and a sheriff all too happy to be rid of every last one of its troublemakers, was that a freak gas explosion in an old abandoned mine had tragically killed everyone involved in an illegal treasure hunt. The matter was closed. "Where do we go from here?" Delilah asked. She was looking out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of open territory, and for the first time since he'd met her, Colton saw something in her eyes that might have been hope. "Anywhere but here," Colton replied, helping her mount her horse. "We're married now. For better or for worse. Might as well go find out what better looks like." As they rode away, not looking back at the town that had tried to destroy them both, Colton realized that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the only ending that makes sense. His father's debt had been paid, not with money, but with fire and earth. And in the crucible of those few chaotic hours, a bond had been forged between him and the mysterious widow, Delilah Rhodes. She had taught him that true courage wasn't about facing death without fear. It was about choosing to build something new from the ashes of what others had tried to burn down. Behind them, the crater that had once been a backyard stood as a silent, gaping monument to the terrible price of greed. But ahead of them, the future was a blank page, a territory vast enough for 2 people who had learned the hard way that the most valuable treasure in the world isn't gold. It's finding the one person willing to walk into the darkness alongside you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. We've got another unforgettable tale coming your way, where destiny and courage collide in ways you'll never see coming. And if you really want to support the channel, consider sending a super chat. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep bringing you more stories just like this one.